Thank you, everyone. What we just heard from Jules in particular shows, I think, how together we at City Hall and TfL and the London boroughs are more than the sum of our parts. The Safer Lorry scheme, which we're introducing, would be impossible in its current form for either of us to do on our own. We don't have the power to do some parts of it. The councils don't have the power to do other parts of it, but together we can do something really quite ambitious, really quite dramatic. And that's a really good example of how we can work together, how incredibly important it is that we do work together. Because as Boris said, you own 95% of the roads and not very much can happen without you. Of the £913 million in the cycling vision, about 400 million will be paid directly to councils to spend. And obviously the vast majority of the rest will be spent in local areas. They'll be spent in specific localities. But 400 million or so will go directly to the boroughs to spend a sizable amount of money. And I know there's been some understandable eagerness to know exactly how much you're going to get and what we're going to give it to you for. The fact that we've now decided who the Mini Hollands are and how much we're going to give them unlocks the funding for everyone else. They're getting the single largest awards of any borough, but all the boroughs will also get substantial awards. In the last couple of months, as Boris mentioned, our delivery partners at Sustrans and myself and TfL officials have been liaising very closely with every borough, all 32 boroughs in London, and we've come up with a whole series of route proposals, a whole series of designs. It's most advanced in central London, but it's happening as well in outer London with the quiet ways and the superhighways that will go there. And the principle, I say, when we come to deciding those, as we're very nearly doing, is that anything we do must be of high quality. The expectations of what a cycling scheme consists of have changed, I think, significantly, even in the last couple of years. And what was actually acceptable a couple of years ago probably isn't quite as acceptable now, and what was even deemed good a couple of years ago is probably no more than acceptable now. Now, we don't want to make the perfect the enemy of the good. We don't want to make the best the enemy of the good, but we are determined that everything we fund will be at least adequate. And we're going to set out in a month or so's time the principles that we will apply to all the schemes we fund. But I'll outline them in outline here. Firstly, cycling is now mass transport, particularly in inner central London, and must be treated as such. At the moment, quite a lot of cycling provision seems to assume that hardly anyone cycles, and that cycling can be fitted into the margins of road space that others don't want, as Chris Boardman said. It'll be on the pavement, it'll be in odd little bits of road that nobody else needs. That may do in some cases, but it probably won't do in many cases. Schemes have to be designed for larger numbers of users. They have to be designed on the assumption that lots of people will use them. Typical cycle schemes, nearly all cycle schemes at the moment, designed on the assumption that not very many people cycle. A typical cycle entrance, for instance, is about as wide as this rostrum. It's wide enough for one bicycle at a time. That won't do for mass cycling. Cycle routes are often festooned with chicanes and barriers and other things that will restrict their utility for larger numbers of cycles. Routes need to be consistent. A lot of routes are good in places and then get bad, usually at the difficult places, and then go good again, and you're on the pavement, you're off the pavement, you're up a slope, you're down a slope, you're round a corner. That's again something we're trying to avoid. Schemes must, as far as possible, not bring cyclists into conflict with pedestrians. There's been a penchant for shared space in some schemes of late. We're not absolutely against shared space. In some cases it's the only possible option, but on the whole we don't like it as much as we used to. Bicycles need to be treated as vehicles, really, not as pedestrians. A Toucan crossing, pretty good example of infrastructure that has shared space and cyclists and bicycles mixing. and it probably won't do. What we want is a parallel crossing where there's sufficient volume with a separate track for cyclists and pedestrians. Routes and schemes must take account of how users actually behave, and if they don't, they'll be ignored. We do see a lot of rather pretty-looking cycle tracks that sort of curve round and meander, and actually cyclists want to go more directly, and so what you see in between those meandering curves is the kind of Chris Boardman-style worn-down patch on the grass as cyclists go straight across, and sometimes we've seen little fences erected to keep people on the meanders. That's the sort of thing that makes for a less useful cycle route. But it needn't be heavy and costly. It needn't be elaborate and ugly. There needn't be large amounts of blue paint, which is a subject that frequently comes up in my discussions with many of you. It's often very simple. It's a very good scheme on Kingston Bridge, for instance, which blends in beautifully with the rather old and attractive bridge, but separates cycles simply by a slightly lower level on the pavement. No blue paint, no ugliness, goes very well with a bridge and does the job beautifully. That's the kind of thing we need. Sometimes the reasons why routes are so compromised is not just because of a lack of ambition, it's because we're scared of cyclists. That a lot of your electors dislike them intensely, and quite understandably. They see a cyclist as a kind of aggressive young man in lycra who'll sort of tear through and scare pedestrians and scatter pensioners. And that's a real problem, and I don't deny the truth of that. But this is partly about changing cyclists. It's long-term cultural change we're engaged in. It's making cycling more like it is, making cycling less Darwinian, more like it is in other parts of Europe, where because they have adequate facilities, people of all ages, all ethnicities, all social groups cycle. So you see older people cycling, you see women cycling, and you change the very culture, reduce the testosterone level. It no longer becomes something that only aggressive, confident young men feel confident about doing. That's what good cycling facilities do. They change the nature of cycling. But it's about far more than cyclists, about far, far more than cyclists. The key message I have for everyone here is that better cycling infrastructure is better for everyone, even if they have absolutely no intention of getting on a bike. It means less traffic, it means less crowding on the tube, it means less competition for parking, it means fewer cars in front of yours at the lights. It means a better and more pleasant environment for everyone, and that is the case we have to make to our sometimes cycle-phobic electorates. The next step is as follows. In the next couple of weeks, we've now been through all your submissions on the quiet ways, on the borough schemes, and over the next couple of weeks we'll be writing to you with our suggestions of which schemes we want to fund and how much we want to pay. Perhaps a couple of weeks is slightly optimistic for everyone. Let's call it a month, and then we'll discuss with all of you what steps forward you want to take. We want to get going on this. We've had quite a long preparatory phase with the boroughs, and we've got going already on the Central London grid. We're getting going on the quiet ways, and we want to get the money out to people. So in the next, I'd say 2 to 4 weeks, we will start talking about detailed things, and it's not always large things. The kind of things Jules Pipe talked about very much have their place. The Safer Lorry scheme, 20-mile-an-hour zones, big sort of blanket macro policies. But there is a huge number of small things as well. Small things are as important as the big things. Lots of small things are as important as a few big things. Removing chicanes, creating routes that people want to use, avoiding pedestrian-cyclist conflict. Those are the kind of things we're going to be talking to you about over the next 2 to 4 weeks, and then the checks will start rolling in. Thank you very much.
We're already running late, I'm afraid, but we do have time for a couple of questions for Andrew.
I'll go back into the rostrum.
We'll just do a couple.
This is City